43. Culture in the XVI century. Enlightenment of the XVI century. The long Mongol Tatar yoke strongly delayed the development of culture and enlightenment in Russia. Literacy was weak. Even among the priests there were people who hardly wandered about. Books were handwritten. They were very expensive and very rare. Ignorant copyists allowed a lot of notes and mistakes, often distorting the meaning. The books were looked upon as a magical means. Demand was mainly all sorts of fortune-telling books. The most coarse superstitions were widespread. The unification of the Russian state around Moscow contributed to a more rapid development of culture in all its manifestations. First of all, measures were taken to combat ignorance. In 1551, in Moscow, a church council, a meeting of the clergy, was convened, with the aim of strengthening the position of the church. At the cathedral the king demanded to take measures to eliminate the most outrageous disgrace in the life of the clergy, drunkenness, etc., and to spread the enlightenment among the population. The clergy were invited to open schools for teaching children literacy. The decisions of the cathedral made up a whole book called Stoglov, but they were never put into practice. Schools Ivan IV failed to create, because in the Russian state there were few people sufficiently educated to be teachers. Metropolitan Makary did much for the Russian Enlightenment. He gathered a circle of educated people. With their assistance, several valuable for the time literary and historical works were compiled, in which the idea of the state unity of Russia was conducted. In order to expand education, Ivan IV established a printing house in Moscow. A printing court was built, which issued several liturgical books. Two Russian masters worked at the printing court, Ivan Fedorov and Peter Mstislavets. The first book they published was published in 1564. Technically, it was done well. Semi-literate copyists of books feared that with the development of printing they might lose their earnings. So they spread rumors that printed books are a work of the devil. The excited crowd crushed the printing yard. Ivan Fedorov and his comrades left for Lithuania. They continued their useful activities in Belarus and Ukraine and contributed much to the development of printing. The first failure did not stop Ivan the Terrible. He started a new printing house in the Alexander Sloboda. Despite the poor development of literacy in the broad masses of the people, in the 16th century, among the higher layers of Moscow society were educated people. Several outstanding writers came from their midst. Under the auspices of Metropolitan Makary, there was a small circle of writers who worked on his order. A number of works were compiled that were to glorify the Russian state, including the Stepan book, the history of the formation of the Moscow kingdom, starting from the Kiev Prince Vladimir and his grandmother Olga and brought to Ivan IV. The talented writer was the Tsar Ivan IV himself. Of the boyars, the outstanding writer was Prince Kurbsky, a very learned man. He owns the Story of the Grand Duke of Moscow, Memories of the Reign of Ivan IV, written in defense of the boyars and sharply hostile to the Tsar. The letters of Kurbsky to Tsar Ivan were distinguished by their great literary merits. Nobleman Ivan Peresvetov wrote several political works. The Moscow clerks constituted annals. Art. In the XVI century, in the Russian state there is an original and bright national art. An example of the architecture of that time is the Church of St. Basil the Blessed, now turned into a museum, a true masterpiece of ancient Russian art. It was built by Russian masters, Skivopostniki Kovlev and Barma. Another similar masterpiece is the church in the village of Kolomensko near Moscow, built a little earlier. As the painter's famous Kov masters, the development of education in the Russian state was hindered by the fact that it was cut off by the Livonian Order, Poland and Lithuania from the more cultured countries of Western Europe. Polish and Lithuanian feudal lords and German knights in every possible way prevented the establishment of permanent relations of the Russian state with Europe, fearing that with the spread of education it will become too strong. The Peasant War and the fight against Polish and Swedish intervention in the Russian state in the beginning of the X7th century. 44. Russian state before the Peasant War. Serfdom. In the second half of the XVI century, the situation of the peasants became very difficult. Needing money, the landlords expanded the lordly appetite and increased money and natural requisitions from the peasants. Previously, the size of peasant duties was determined by custom. The peasant plowed the manor plowed land and gave obrokas in the old days. In the XVI century, the landlords, without reckoning more with custom, themselves established the payments and duties of their peasants. The royal decrees prescribed to the peasants to obey the landowner in everything, and to do all kinds of things, as their landlord discovers. The Livonian War caused great expenses. The monetary taxes from peasants and trade and craft population of cities have been increased several times. Fleeing from heavy work, taxes and hunger, peasants threw houses in villages in masses, and left to the east, beyond the Volga, and even more southward, beyond the river Oka. There was spread almost unoccupied black earth steppe, where it was difficult to catch fugitive peasants. With the departure of the peasants, the central part of the state was emptying. The landlord feudal economy, deprived of its labor, was in a very difficult situation. The landowners, who needed peasants, lured them away from each other. Every year the struggle for the peasants began before Yuriev's day. Most of the peasants did not have the money to pay off the landowner. Then for them all the established payments were paid by the clerks of other landlords, and the peasants were transported to the lands of their owners. Rich and powerful landowners even raided the lands of their neighbors. During the raids the peasants were shackled and taken to new places. Medium and small nobles complained that they cannot carry military service from their deserted estates. In 1581, Tsar Ivan IV temporarily, until the Tsar's decree, forbade the transfer of peasants to St. George's Day. Years, during which the transition of peasants to Yuriev Day was forbidden, were called reserved years, from the word commandment prohibition. The peasants became attached more and more to the landowner's land. The Cossacks. In the lower reaches of the Don in the XVI century, Cossacks lived. The word Cossacks in Turkic language was called free people, separated from their people. Russian fugitive peasants and serfs, who settled on the Don, also began to call themselves Cossacks. The influx of the Russian population to the Don especially increased in the late 16th century. In connection with the strengthening of feudal oppression in the central regions of the Russian state, the steppe, rich in game, and rivers rich in fish, could feed a relatively large population on the Don. The Cossacks felt safe from the arbitrariness of the landlords and the Tsarist voivodes. They did not farm, they brought bread from Russian cities. The Cossacks raided the Tatar and Turkish possessions on the Azov and Black Seas and, in case of luck, captured a large prey. Sometimes Cossacks plundered Russian merchants on the Volga. General questions relating to the campaigns, the division of production, relations with Moscow, the Cossacks decided on a gathering that was called a circle. On it they chose their chiefs, atamans. Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich. After the death of Tsar Ivan IV, his sons remained alive. Fyodor, from his first wife, Anastasia Romanova, and young Dmitry, from his last wife, Maria Nagoya. Tsar became Fyodor Ivanovich, 1584–1598. Tsarevich Dmitry, along with his mother and her relatives, were sent to the small town of Uglich, which was given to the little prince, for destiny. Tsar Fyodor was a morbid and half-witted man, completely incapable of governing the country. For days he prayed in the churches, loved to ring bells, or watch the jesters grimacing and fighting before him. The people openly said that the new king is a fool. The power and government of the state were seized by the relatives of the Tsar and the boyars close to him. Among them, Boyar Boris Fedorovich Godunov quickly moved forward. The Godunov family did not belong in origin to a very ancient nobility. Boris Godunov approached the Tsar in the last years of Ivan IV's life, mainly due to kinship ties. On the sister of Godunov, Irina, Fyodor Ivanovich was married. Boris Godunov possessed great abilities, but did not receive a good, for his time, education. He did not stick, like the noble boyars, for the past, did not shun foreigners. Boris Godunov first of all removed from the Tsar's palace those boyars that interfered with his power. In his house, he established an order that resembled the life of the royal palace, and he himself accepted foreign ambassadors. In the last years of the life of Tsar Fyodor, Boris Godunov managed all affairs in the state. He did much to strengthen state power in the interests of the nobility. Boris Godunov understood the importance of the church in this matter. The Orthodox Church in Russia was ruled by a metropolitan who lived in Moscow. The supreme ecclesiastical authority in the Russian Church was the Patriarch of Constantinople. Patriarchs lived in a country subordinate to the Turkish Sultan. At the end of the XVI century, they began to go to Moscow for begging, alms money or sable fur. At dawn on May 17, 1606, an agreed blow of the bell was heard, and after a short time the alarm bells rang all around the capital. Muscovites shouted to each other, "Go to the Lithuanian, beat the Lithuanian." Lithuanians called the Poles. False Demetrius learned of the danger only when the crowd filled the square in front of the palace. Trying to escape, he jumped out of the window, but when he fell, he crashed violently. He was found and killed. A few days later the corpse of the false Dmitri was burned. The ashes from the corpse were put into a cannon and fired in the direction from which false Dmitri came. Meanwhile, in different parts of Moscow crowds of people were being thrown out by Polish pans and gentry who locked themselves in their yards. Muscovites with knives and stones went to the attack of houses, turned by well-armed Poles into small fortresses. About 2,000 Polish gentry and soldiers were killed, the rest surrendered. The boyars were afraid of a popular uprising and hurried to stop it. First of all, they needed to restore the royal power. For this, they nominated the Boyar Vyshysky, who came from an ancient princely family, to the kings. The boyars did not want to convene the Zemsky Sobor for the election of the Tsar, as they feared that most of the nobles and townspeople would be at the cathedral against the boyars. Therefore, the proclamation of Basilshevsky was made king without any election. His name was screamed in the crowd gathered on May 19 in front of the Kremlin, in which there were many supporters of Shysky. Thus, the Poles' attempt to put their protege on the throne of Moscow ended in complete failure. The Russian people did not allow this. Tsar Vasily Shysky, 1606-1610. Becoming king, Vasily Shysky promised to rule the country in accord with the boyars. A cross-religious record oath was drawn up, according to which the Tsar could neither condemn anyone to death, nor deprive the relatives of the convicted persons of their property without the consent of the Boyar Duma. They sent letters on cities in which Shysky proved his rights to the royal throne. The rich boyars hastened to seize the best and most profitable posts. The accession of Vasily Shysky caused a new explosion of discontent in the country. The nobles did not want to reconcile themselves to the seizure of power by the boyars. In Moscow itself there was unrest among the poor population of the townspeople. Fearing the uprising in the capital, the boyars hurriedly prepared the Kremlin for defense. Guns were placed on its walls, a permanent bridge was thrown across the moat at the fortress gates. 46. Peasant uprising led by Bolotnikov. The movement of Bolotnikov. In the reign of Vasily Shysky throughout the entire Russian state, a peasant war unfolded. It began in the autumn of 1606 in the southwestern cities, where many runaway peasants and serfs gathered. They were joined by Cossacks and small servicemen. To the east of the lower Oka, along with the Russian population, the Mordva rose. In the south, the uprising broke out in Astrakhan. On the northwest of Moscow, the movement spread in the Tver, Pskov and Novgorod lands. So for a short time a significant part of the state was covered by a broad stripe of popular uprisings. The rising movement was characterized by fragmented local performances. At a time when the uprising in one district was just beginning, in another it was already over. Therefore, the insurgents could rarely help each other. The largest was the uprising of peasants, serfs and Cossacks under the leadership of Ivan Bolotnikov. In his youth, Bolotnikov was a boyar serf. He escaped to the Cossacks on the Don, but was captured by the Tatars, who sold him to the Turks. For some time Bolotnikov worked as a rower on the galley, where he, like the rest of the slaves, was chained to the bench and jeered with the whip. But Bolotnikov managed to free himself from the Turkish captivity. After that, having visited various European countries, he reached the Russian border. At that moment revolts against Shishki began in the southwestern regions. Bolotnikov became the leader of the insurgents. According to his contemporaries, he was tall, possessed great physical strength and was distinguished by fearlessness and courage. Foreigners called Bolotnikov a brave and experienced hero. In battles with the Tsarist troops, he discovered great military capabilities. Wherever Bolotnikov's detachments appeared, the peasants rose against the landlords and joined the insurgents. The urban poor also moved to his side. The army of Bolotnikov from Putivl quickly approached Moscow through Kromy, Serpukhov and Kolumna, smashing the Tsarist detachments along the way. In Ulis, the rebels found large stockpiles of weapons prepared by false Dmitrii. On the way to Moscow, Bolotnikov was joined by the Tula nobility, led by his Tom Pashkov, who were dissatisfied with the boyar government. The brothers Prokopy and Zakhar Lyapunov brought with them the Ryazan landlords. Including the nobility, the army of Bolotnikov became more numerous, but less homogeneous. In mid-October 1606 Bolotnikov approached Moscow. The capital was well protected by 3 rows of stone walls. Bolotnikov could not take it by storm. The siege began. Bolotnikov wrote and distributed to the population appeals, which were then called charming from the word deceive by letters. In them he urged the peasants and serfs to destroy the boyars and landlords and promised to give the peasants the land seized by the feudal lords. The nobles, who were in the army of Bolotnikov, understood that the peasants, that is, their class enemies, were more dangerous to them than the boyar government. The Ryazan noblemen, led by the Lyapunov brothers, went over to Shishki. In early December, the Tsarist troops, after receiving large reinforcements, attacked the Bolotnikov camp near the village of Kolomensky near Moscow. In the midst of the battle, the Tula noblemen, led by Tom Pashkov, also went over to the side of Shishki and, through their betrayal, facilitated the victory of the Tsarist troops. Bolotnikov with the remnants of his troops went to the south and strengthened in Kaluga. Trying to win over the nobles to his side, Tsar Vasily Shishki increased the period during which it was permitted to look for runaway peasants, from 5 to 15 years. In the spring of 1607, a large Tsarist army besieged Kaluga, but fresh rebel detachments came to the aid of Bolotnikov. The troops of Shishki were defeated and stopped the siege. Bolotnikov moved to Tula, where he joined up with fresh detachments of Cossacks. Among them was a new impostor, who called himself the son of Fyodor Ivanovich, Peter. In fact, Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich had no sons. In the summer of the same year, Shishki assembled a new large army. For 4 months Bolotnikov defended himself in Tula against the enemy, which several times exceeded the number of the army of Bolotnikov. Despite the famine and the lack of ammunition, the besieged every day made bold outings and inflicted heavy losses on the Tsarist army. The Tsarist voivodes feared that their troops would not suffer a winter siege. Then a dam was built near Tula, which stopped the flow of the Upa River. Water poured into the city and flooded the last supplies of food and gunpowder. Only then the besieged entered into negotiations for surrender. Tsar Vasily Shishki promised to release all the rebels to freedom. But he did not keep this promise. Ivan Bolotnikov was sent to the north, to Kargopol, and there they drowned. Many participants in the uprising, turning serfs into serfs and serfs were given to the nobles. The rebellion of Bolotnikov, like all other peasant uprisings of the feudal era, ended in the defeat of the insurgents. The peasant uprisings of that time were spontaneous in nature. Peasants and serfs were poorly armed, were not trained in military affairs and could not withstand a long struggle with the better organized and armed Tsarist troops. The peasants felt the injustice and heaviness of the feudal authorities, but did not know what to replace it with. Therefore, they believed that a good king could improve the condition of the people. Bolotnikov died, his troops dispersed, but the uprising against Shuisky continued. On the Volga, even at the time when Bolotnikov was standing near Moscow, the peoples, the Mordva and the Marie, Sheremis, enslaved by Tsarism, had risen. Having joined the Russian peasants and serfs, they besieged Nizhny Novgorod. The Tsarist troops, having dealt with Bolotnikov, threw the insurgents from the city. But in the autumn of 1608 all the Middle Volga region was again covered by the uprising. 47. The offensive of Poland and Sweden on the Russian state. New Polish protege False Dmitry II. Failures with False Dmitry I did not stop the aggressive actions of Poland. Already on the day of the death of False Dmitry I, the Poles circulated the rumor around Moscow that another man had been killed in his stead. However, at first the Poles could not send new troops to the Russian state, since in Poland itself part of the gentry rose against the king, being dissatisfied with the attempts of the king to limit gentry liberties. In 1607 the rebellious gentry was defeated by the royal troops. This allowed Sigismund III to turn again to Russian affairs. In the fall of 1607, a new Polish protege appeared on the Moscow border, again taking the name of Tsarevich Dmitry Ivanovich, False Dmitry II. Nobody knew who he really was. Poles sent anew False Dmitrius large military forces, collected with the permission of the king. Among them were regular Polish troops. A relative of the Lithuanian Chancellor Jan Sapieha led a detachment of up to 7,000 men, infantry and cavalry. Hetman Rosinski came with a detachment of 4,000 soldiers. Detachments of Don and Zaporozhye Cossacks also gathered for False Dmitry II. In the spring of 1608, in a two-day battle near Volkhov, the Tsarist troops were defeated. The main forces of False Dmitry II went to Moscow through Kaluga and Mozhaisk. They made an attempt to capture Moscow, but were thrown back. Then near the capital, on the high bank of the Moskva River near the village of Toshino, the Poles staged a fortified camp. By the name of this camp in Toshino, False Dmitry II was called the Toshino Tsar or Toshino's thief. Thieves in Russia were called all criminals. In Toshino, the army of False Dmitry II, consisting mainly of Polish and Cossack detachments, was put in order. Cossacks became commanded by Ivan Zarutsky I, a nobleman of origin, while the leadership of the military operations and the general command of the Poles were left in their hands. The situation of Moscow has become very difficult. The famine began in the city. Discontent with the king intensified. Even many boyars and noblemen, anticipating the imminent death of Vasily Shuisky, went to the Toshino camp. There they received letters from False Dmitry II for estates and other awards. Some noblemen moved several times from Moscow to Toshino and back. Such people were called flights. Having besieged Moscow, the Toshino detachments began to spread in different directions from the capital. Heroic resistance to the Polish invaders was rendered by the Trinity Sergius Monastery, 70 km from Moscow, now Zagorsk, behind the high walls of which the surrounding peasant population was sheltered. Withstood the brutal bombardment of cannon, the defenders of the monastery courageously repulsed all attacks of the enemy and inflicted great losses on them during their sorties. But significant successes were achieved in the region of the Upper Volga. The rich Volga and northern cities of Yaroslavl, Vologda, Kostroma and others recognized the power of False Dmitry II. The population of these places did not even know what the power of the Toshino Tsar represented. Many thought that they were fighting against the hated Boyar King for Tsarevich Dmitry. Guerrilla war against the Poles. Gradually, deception opened. In cities, Poles selected goods from merchants and imposed heavy taxes on the population. In the villages, the Tushino detachments plundered the peasants, robbed the grain and hay, killed the inhabitants, and burnt the buildings. The Panas took Russian cities and lands for their salaries, that is, they collected incomes from them in their favor. Peasants in the villages, small craftsmen, servicemen and merchants in the cities themselves began to fight against the invaders. Peasant detachments appeared, commanded either by the peasants themselves and serfs, or by military servicemen. They boldly attacked the well-armed Polish troops. From the end of 1608, a guerrilla war was raging everywhere in the country. Tsar Vasily Shuisky, convinced that he alone cannot cope with the Tushinites and unrest in the country, turned to the Swedish King Charles IX for help. Under the concluded contract of Sweden, the city of Karela, Kaxholm with the county was ceded. Sweden, for its part, promised to send Vasily Shuisky military assistance to drive out the Polish troops and restore his power in the country. In fact, Sweden has long been waiting for the opportunity to seize the bordering Russian lands and again cut off Russia from the sea. Having concluded a profitable alliance with Vasily Shuisky, the Swedish king sent a strong detachment of troops to Novgorod in the spring of 1609 under the command of Jacob de Lagarde. The detachment consisted of 15,000 mercenaries, Swedes, Germans, Englishmen, Scots, French and others. He was joined by the Tsar's nephew, Prince M.V. Skopin-Shuisky, with Russian military men. The Russian-Swedish detachment traveled from Novgorod via Tver to Moscow, freeing the cities occupied by the Tushin people along the way. The beginning of the Polish War with the Russian state. The resistance of the Russian people to the Polish invaders showed the Panamanians and the gentry that the support rendered to them by the impostors does not reach the goal. Meanwhile, the Russian land was devastated by years of war. The government of Vasily Shuisky could hardly hold. The Polish gentry therefore decided that the time had come for the final blow to the Russian state. The senators advised the king not to miss the opportunity to increase the possessions of the Polish state. In the early spring of 1609, preparations began for war. All summer Polish detachments attacked the borderlands and robbed Belarusian peasants. In autumn a large Polish army led by King Sigismund III crossed the border and besieged Smolensk. After Poland began an open war with the Russian state, false Dmitry II was no longer needed. Therefore, Sigismund III called on the Poles who served as Dmitry II to their army near Smolensk. Meanwhile, in the winter of 1609, Russian-Swedish troops Skopin-Shuisky and de Lagarde, moving from Novgorod, came close to Moscow. With their approach, the Poles removed the siege of the Trinity Sergius Monastery. In early January 1610, false Dmitry II with the Cossacks escaped from Tushin to Kaluga. It was followed by a part of the Poles, still hoping with the help of false Dmitry II to master Moscow. Served at false Dmitry II, Russian boyars and nobles decided to negotiate with the Polish king. They agreed to recognize the King of Poland, Polish King Vladislav, and concluded on February 4, 1610, an agreement with Sigismund III. Sigismund on behalf of Vladislav promised not to change the Moscow state order, to preserve the power of the nobles and their landed estates, and also to return noblemen to runaway peasants. So the Tushino camp finally fell apart. In March 1610 Skopin-Shuisky with Russian-Swedish troops entered Moscow. Shortly thereafter Skopin-Shuisky died suddenly. The Smolensk, besieged by the Poles, stubbornly defended themselves under the command of the brave Boyar Shane. The king decided, continuing the siege of Smolensk, to send for the occupation of Moscow an army under the command of the Polish hetman Zolkiewski. Towards the approaching Zolkiewski to Moscow, troops were sent under the command of the brother of the Tsar, Dmitry Shuisky. The meeting took place in June 1610 near the village of Klushino. During the battle, mercenaries, Germans and Swedes, changed and went over to the side of the Poles. The Tsarist troops were defeated, the road to Moscow was opened. The Poles released the Swedes who had crossed over to them, who had left for the Novgorod region, and began to prepare for the capture of Novgorod. In July 1610, the starving population of Moscow rose against Vasily Shuisky. At that time, false Dmitry II came to Moscow from Kaluga again. Then the boyars and nobles overthrew Vasily Shuisky from the throne. In Moscow, a provisional boyar government was formed, which included 7 people who belonged to the ancient, in most cases princely, families. This boyar government began to be called semi-boyar. The capture of Moscow by the Poles and the Novgorod region by the Swedes. Boyar government, fearing a popular uprising and the capture of the capital by the Cossacks, false Dmitry II, hurried to agree with Zhukhovsky. It agreed to recognize the Tsar Vladislav of Moscow with the condition that he would rule together with the boyars. Having concluded this agreement, the boyar government treacherously admitted the Polish army to Moscow. To conclude a peace, a large embassy was sent to Sigismund III near Smolensk. But the Polish king wanted to become a Moscow Tsar himself in order to subordinate the Russian state to Poland. The noblemen who were at the embassy sent letters to Moscow describing the plight and humiliation of the embassy. They urged the Russian people not to obey the king and his son king. "Put strong advice amongst you," they wrote, "send our letter to Novgorod, and to Vologda, and Nizhny Novgorod, so that everyone will be aware." The Poles arrested the Moscow ambassadors and sent them to Poland. The Moscow boyar government was in the most humiliating position. Restoration of the state. As a result of the long war and the interventionists, the country was devastated. In the first decade of Michael's reign, the Zemsky Sobbers, which acted continuously, rendered great assistance to the government in restoring state administration. They discussed all the current needs of the state, set new taxes, etc. In the event of general ruin, it was difficult to collect taxes from the population. The Zemsky Sobor sent representatives to their places to help the royal tax collectors. After the conclusion of peace with Poland, the father of King Filaret Romanov returned from Polish captivity. In Moscow, he was immediately made a patriarch and actually began to rule the state. All edicts were written in the name of the Tsar and his father. Filaret even took the title of Great Sovereign. In his person was connected secular and spiritual power, the power of the Tsar and the Patriarch. Thanks to this, the central government has intensified. The landlords used the restoration of strong central power to finally suppress the peasant movement and restore its power over the serf village. At Aman and other prosperous Cossacks, the government generously distributed the land with the peasants. The upper stratum of the Cossacks thus became the landlords. The Cossack poor soon finished. The Tsar's voivoda everywhere pursued and smashed the Cossack detachments. In 1616, a fairly strong movement broke out among peasants and serfs in the Nizhny Novgorod district. The insurgents killed the nobles, burned villages and villages. In the same year, the Tatars and Mari became agitated in the Kazan district. They approached the cities and tried to connect with the rebels of the Nizhny Novgorod region. The uprising was suppressed. Having dealt with the rebels, the landlords used their victory for further enslavement of the peasants. Under the pressure of the nobility and monasteries, the government by a number of decrees increased the terms of the search for runaway peasants to 15 years, instead of the previous 5 years. This was the preparation of a complete cancellation of a certain period, school years, for the search of runaway peasants. 50. Foreign policy after the Peasant War. The war with Poland for Smolensk. The Russian state could not be reconciled with the loss of the ancient Russian city of Smolensk with its district. Smolensk was a first-class fortress that protected the crossing of the Dnieper, and had great commercial significance. Therefore, during the entire period of the Dulin Truce, the Moscow government was actively preparing for a new war. Events of the beginning of the X7th century. vividly demonstrated the technical backwardness of Russian statehood. The government of Tsar Mikhail tried to hasten to raise the combat qualities and equipment of the Russian army. Abroad, a large number of weapons were purchased from the Dacha people, i.e., recruit peasants from monastic and some landed estates, and from hunting people, volunteers. Russian regiments of the foreign system were formed, the organization of which used the experience of Western European armies. In 1632 the Moscow army began the siege of Smolensk. At the head of the army was Boyar Shane, famous in 1610-1611 GG. Heroic defense of Smolensk. In Poland at this time died Sigismund III, the new king was not yet chosen, and the country was in turmoil. Smolensk was heavily fortified, and the siege dragged on. Among the foreigners who were in the Russian military service, discipline was very bad. They were at enmity with each other and often switched sides. The Polish government bribed the Crimean Tatars to attack the Russian borders. The nobles, who had lands in the southern districts, left the army on their own to defend their estates from the Tatars. This weakened the fighting strength of the army. Shane did not cope with his task and missed a convenient time to master the fortress. Elected in Poland, King Vladislav IV, son of Sigismund III, hurried with the army to the rescue of the Polish garrison in Smolensk. The Russians were sandwiched between Vladislav's troops and the fortifications of Smolensk. After several attempts to break out of the encirclement, Shane faintly agreed to stop the hostilities and give all the artillery to the enemy. On these conditions, the Russian troops were released home. In Moscow, Shane was accused of treason and executed. Further efforts of the Poles were stopped under the fortress Balia. On the offer to surrender, the small garrison of the fortress replied that he would protect her while he was alive. The threat of war with Turkey and the resistance encountered at Balia forced King Władysław to hasten with the conclusion of peace. The world was concluded on the border river Polianakivka in 1634. Poland retained for itself Smolensk and other cities captured during the intervention, but agreed to recognize Michael as Russian Tsar. Vladislav finally abandoned his claims to the throne of the king. Relations with the Crimea and Turkey. One of the reasons for the failure of Russian troops near Smolensk was the attacks of Crimean Tatars on the southern counties. After the end of the war, the Moscow government began very vigorously for the construction of a new Tsay-Seknoy line fortifications, which protected the southern border from the Tatar raids. These fortifications provided for the possession of a fertile steppe, which Russian landowners began to seize. In 1637 the Don Cossacks attacked the fortress of Azov, which was in the hands of the Turks. This fortress protected the exit from the Don to the Azov Sea and prevented the Don Cossacks from raiding the Crimean coast. After a 2-month siege, the Cossacks took Azov by storm. In 1641 the Turkish Sultan sent to Azov a large army with strong artillery. A small Cossack detachment, sitting in Azov, courageously repelled 24 attacks and forced the Turks to lift the siege. Expecting new attacks, the Cossacks were sent to Moscow to ask for help. The government of Tsar Michael did not dare to start a war with Turkey for Azov, without enlisting the support of the Zemsky Sabor. Collected in 1642 to the cathedral, servicemen and merchants, although they supported the adoption of Azov under the rule of the king, but at the same time bitterly complained about the severity of the taxation, on the bribe takers, on the oppression of the governor and on other disorders in state administration. Making sure that it is difficult to count on the active support of even the ruling classes, the government ordered the Cossacks to leave Azov. 51. Feudal serf economy in the 17th century. Position of the peasants in the X7th century. As in the preceding centuries of feudalism, the land of each feudal domain was subdivided into lordly and peasant. The peasants cultivated their plots and farmed them, which gave them the means to live. The peasants, in addition, processed their landowners' land, very arable land, with their inventory, the crop from which went completely in his favor. As V. Lenin pointed out, The following conditions are necessary for the existence of this system of farming, called corvée farming. Firstly, the domination of subsistence economy. The surface state should have been a self-contained, closed whole, which is in a very weak connection with the rest of the world. Secondly, for such an economy it is necessary that the peasant be endowed with land and attached to it so that he cannot escape from the landowner. The third condition is the personal dependence of the peasant on the landowner. If the landlord did not have direct power over the peasant's personality, Lenin wrote, he could not force to work for himself a man endowed with land and leading his own economy. The fourth condition, and consequence of the corvée economy is an extremely low and routine state of technology, for the management of the economy was in the hands of small peasants, crushed by need, belittled by personal dependence and mental darkness. The dependence of the peasants on landowners, which arose with the advent of feudal economy, became increasingly difficult with time. The Tsarist government had a number of decrees in the 16th century, and in the first half of the X7th century, formalized and further strengthened the power of the landowners over the peasants. The peasants lost the right to move to Yuriev's day. The landlords began to search for and return fugitive peasants for 5, and then 15 years. However, this did not satisfy the landowners, who insisted on the complete destruction of the terms for the search and the return of the fugitives. They have achieved this. According to the Code of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, 1649, fleeing peasants, if caught, were given to the old owners with all the family and property, no matter how much time elapsed from the peasants' escape. The landowners arbitrarily transferred the peasants from one possession to another. The cases of selling peasants without land became more frequent. Thus, the feudal dependence of the peasants was expressed in serfdom, formalized by state laws. The rural population in the Russian state of the X7th century divided into several categories. The privately owned peasants lived on lands belonging to monasteries, churches, boyars and landlords. The peasants, who were assigned to the royal palace and supplied food for its needs, were called palace ones. The rest of the land belonged to the state, and the peasants who lived on them were called black or black-eared. All peasants were taxed with heavy royal taxes. In the X7th century, the number of privately owned peasants continued to increase. The government of the first czars from the house of the Romanovs gave the palace nobles and noblemen a large number of lands with black-skinned and palace peasants who lived on them. The royal families reaped large tracts of land. By the end of this century, the previously existing difference between estates and patrimonies almost disappeared, as most estates began to be inherited. The situation of privately owned peasants was particularly difficult. In the X7th century, the landlords continued to increase the size of their own plow, which was farmed by peasant labor. In addition, the peasants contributed to the landowner a natural rent, consisting of a variety of agricultural products and rural industries. The products received from the peasants went to feed the family of the landowner and his servants. The peasants, in addition to the products of their economy, were to pay the landlord a financial rent, usually in the amount of 50 kopecks to 1 ruble from the peasant household. With the onset of autumn, when harvesting was over, many peasants switched to various crafts, weaved linen cloth, wooled, skinned, made mittens, turned out wooden utensils, forged iron tools from the ground, etc. Some of these products remained in the peasant farm or was given as a quit rent to the landowner. The other part was sold in the nearest market. In need of money to pay royal taxes and money to the landowners, the peasants were even more connected with the market, because only through the sale of their products they could receive the necessary money. With the development of peasant trade, stratification among the peasants intensified. Peasant buyers were born in the villages. Some of them completely abandoned agriculture and turned into merchants. Landowners in the X7th century. They were not satisfied with the products that they received from the peasants or from their serfs and artisans. Rich boyar and capital dvoryanin sewed clothes from Italian velvet or English cloth, wore sable hats, loved expensive ornaments, drank imported wine, imported foreign things in their household use. All these items they could buy only in the market for money received from the peasants or obtained from the sale of farm products. Serf economy began to adapt to the developed in the X7th century. Market. An example of a large serfdom in the middle of the X7th century was the household of the boyar Boris Ivanovich Morozov. Morozov had about 300 villages in his vast estates. In them lived more than 40,000 serfs. Morozov received money incomes from the peasants every year to 10,000 rubles, about 170,000 rubles for money at the beginning of the 20th century. Hundreds of thousands of puds of grain were stored in numerous barns. During the war with Poland, Morozov took advantage of high grain prices and made a fortune. Near Morozov, up to 700 servicemen and janitors lived in the courtyard of the yard, for the maintenance of which serf peasants supplied a large number of different products. Morozov started iron-making in potash plants and forced his peasants to perform the hardest work on them. Potash, ashes of special preparation, was sold to foreign merchants. Manufactories. Craftsmen who lived in cities, with rare exceptions, were not connected with agriculture. They bought raw materials in the market and sold their own products. In each larger city there were dozens of various crafts. Along with the development of handicraft production in the X7th century, appeared in Russia's first manufactories. The artisan alone produces the product of his labor. In factories, a certain number of workers work together, depending on the size of the enterprise. They perform separate parts of the overall work. Work in the manufactory is done manually with the help of simple tools. The name, manufactory, comes from the Latin words, manus, hand, and factus, processed. Compared with the labor of an artisan, manufactory gives higher labor productivity. In 1632 the Dutch merchant André Vingius got the right to develop iron ore near Tula and built the first iron-making factory that laid the foundation for the future Tula iron-making plants. A few years later a glass factory was founded near Moscow. In the second half of the X7th century, the state, merchants and landowners organized manufactories, iron works, copper smelting, glass, paper and tanning. The main cadres of workers at the manufactories of that time consisted of peasants, serfs or other dependent people. Among them appeared and hired free, working people, which came from the poorest layers of the urban population. Trade. Previously, small hitchhiking, which occurred in cities and some large villages, were little connected. In the X7th century, between trade in villages and cities established permanent trade relations. This led to the fact that in some places the urban and rural population began to specialize in the production of a particular product. The Black Earth regions supplied their bread to the central regions of the state. Yaroslavl was famous for the production of mirrors, which were exported even to Siberia. Vologda produced different products of iron, Kaluga was known for skillful works of wood, etc. In the southern cities it was possible to meet merchants from the northern Pomerania. In the northern cities, various trading people gathered who bought goods for export to Arkhangelsk, Siberia and other places. So the regions and cities lost their former economic isolation. In the X7th century, as Lenin points out, the merging of small markets and trades into one, all-Russian market. With the development of trade exchange between the regions, there was an actual merger of all the lands that once were part of separate principalities into one whole. Everywhere the local features that were left from former times disappeared and a general order was established for the whole of Russia. The largest shopping center was Moscow. Major trade operations were carried out at gatherings fairs near Nizhny Novgorod, Bryansk, in western Siberia, etc. Trade linked the Russian state with many foreign powers. The largest port city on trade with Western Europe was Arkhangelsk. Every summer, a large number of English, Dutch and German ships came to the port of Archangelsk with various goods, cloths, silk fabrics, expensive utensils, weapons, metals, etc. By that time, a shoe shop in Moscow in the X7th century, the river Severnaya Dvina, Illyrius. Russian merchants traveled with Siberian furs, skins, hemp, flax, tar, potash, lard, with the products of peasants and urban artisans. Trade with the East was mainly through Astrakhan, where Bukhara and Persian merchants brought Eastern goods. Cities. The development of handicraft production and trade contributed to the growth of cities. The city in the Russian state of the XVI, X7 centuries consisted of several parts. The central part of the city was usually surrounded by wooden, and in some large cities and stone walls, with loopholes and towers. Outside the fortifications were administrative buildings, food and gunpowder were stored, special huts for the population in case of siege. This part of the city was called the Kremlin, a prison or simply, cities. To the fortified city adjoined settlements of artisans and small dealers, who were posad. Next, behind the plantation, among the meadows and fields, were scattered individual settlements and villages that belonged to monasteries or boyars. The development of domestic and foreign trade contributed to the development of the merchant class. The upper layer of the merchants, who enjoyed great privileges, wore the title of guests. This title was given by special royal certificates. The Russian merchants fought against foreign, English, Dutch, German and other merchants, who sought to take the Russian market into their own hands. Russian merchants obtained from the government a ban on duty-free trade for foreigners. Preparing for the war with Poland for Smolensk, the Moscow government hired several regiments of foreign soldiers abroad. However, the experience of the siege of Smolensk in 1632 showed all the unsuitability and unreliability of undisciplined mercenaries who sold their weapons to those who paid more. Therefore, when Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich went to another method, already tried with his father, regiments were being recruited from the Russian, Dacha people and hunters. Foreign instructors were invited to teach foreigners. Thus, the regiments of the foreign system formed the rear-raiders, horse and soldiers, foot soldiers, in which only the officers were foreigners. In the years following Alexei Mikhailovich's death, the Russian army had 63 regiments of new formations, which accounted for 60% of all troops, not counting the Cossacks. Thus, in the X7th century, began the reorganization of the army, raising its fighting qualities. Under Alexei Mikhailovich, an attempt was made to create a fleet. For navigation on the Caspian Sea, the ship Aral was built, but it was destroyed on the Volga during the Razin uprising.